All right, if you're a hairstylist and you're someone who specializes in extensions, or maybe even you're new to the industry, you're sitting there, you're looking at so many different kinds of wefts, and you're like, what the fuck am I supposed to buy? Is there one that's better than the other? So I'm actually going to be giving you a run through of what hand-tied wefts are and also what Genius wefts are. Now, I will say in the industry, they kind of have different names here and there, but at the end of the day, hand-tied is hand-tied, Genius is Genius. So let's get into, is one better than the other? When should you be using them, or does it even actually matter? Now, what makes hand-tied wefts different from an actual Genius weft? Hand-tied is essentially that. It is a weft that has been hand-tied by a person and put together. I will let you know, they are my preference. They will always be my preference. They are the loves of my life, but I do also love Genius wefts. Now, Genius wefts, I always say, are somewhere in between, almost like a hand-tied weft and a machine-tied weft. They are really, that seam is really small and thin like a hand-tied weft, except there is a sealant that goes over the top of the seam of a Genius weft. So that sealant is essentially what makes it the biggest difference between hand-tied and Genius. Now, one of the biggest things that you're going to notice whenever you are actually coloring wefts is that does make a very big difference on hand-tied versus Genius. A hand-tied weft, even if you go through and you color it, the seam, that very top part, does color down. So if you're trying to take it from, let's say the top of the weft is an 8 and you're trying to take it down to a 6, it will absolutely, the whole thing will color down to a 6. Now with a Genius weft, on the other hand, because of that sealant on that very top, it does not color down. So let's say you have a level 8 weft, but you need the root to be a 6. If you go through and you color a Genius weft down to a 6, you will have that brighter band that because of the sealant. The seam is going to stay at a level 8, but then whatever else you colored will drop down to that 6. So I tell people that's also something to consider. Now, morning hair does have a very, very, very bright blonde where only the seam of the weft is a little bit darker like a level 8, because that way, if you need to root it or something, that kind of helps with that blend. But that's one thing I tell people, like, just be aware as you're going through and coloring or choosing which type of weft to use. Are you going to have to color it down? Because if you have to color it down more than, I mean, honestly, even a couple of levels, it might end up kind of, with the Genius weft, it might kind of like show up like a little highlighter and kind of accentuate the difference of extensions as opposed to being a little more hidden. One of the other very large differences of a Genius weft versus a hand-tied weft is you can not cut a hand-tied weft without it unraveling unless you use glue. You can't. The minute you cut it, because it's literally tied by hand, depending on how good the seam is, I mean, if you pull one piece, it's literally like, the whole thing is just gonna fucking come apart. Do you know what I mean? While on the flip side, a Genius weft, because it has that sealant on top, you can cut it any which way and it is not going to unravel. Now that I feel really does come to play and be important depending on the type of extensions you're doing and the row itself. Like if I'm doing a full row, if I can use hand-tied, I'm always gonna do that. But if I have to start doing split rows or micro minis or something that does involve more cutting, my preference does now become Genius wefts, just to ensure that there's not more points later on that could potentially come undone. Like I said, my preference is absolutely hand-tied, but I really do wanna give you some pros and cons of each. Now, I'll start with Genius wefts. Whenever I'm deciding like, okay, what kind of extension do I need for this client? The first thing I really look at is texture and lifestyle. Now, with morning hair, my hairline, we do not and will not ever make textured hair. So I'm talking natural body, deep wave, curly, kinky curly. We will never make those in hand-tied because hand-tied really should not be air dried. And we'll get into that. So because most textures, especially the curly girls, they are going through and they are air drying their hair, it's just better to use hand-tied hair. Now, the same also goes with, I always ask clients, like, how active is their lifestyle? Having lived in California for 8 years, a lot of people serve, and they serve quite often, and they either don't want to blow dry their hair, they don't have time, or their hair just spends a lot of time wet. If I have a client that is very, very active like that, they're in the ocean a lot, or even if they're swimmers and they're not wearing a cap, right? Or something like that, or honestly, even if they're really big gym goers and they're just kind of like a sweaty Betty, which is totally fine, I might now opt for Genius Wefts just to give them a little bit of like, I would say it's like a break, right? They don't have to go through and dry that seam. They don't really have to do as much work as they would with hand-tied hair. Now, I will say hand-tied hair really should not be air dried for a couple of reasons. Number one, the hair, when it gets wet, everything swells a little bit, even if you're not noticing it. So it can go through and swell, and that I've had it irritate clients before, but also it can get moldy depending on how much hair you have in and how long it stays wet. I am lucky that I've never actually seen it happen in real life in the 16 years I've been doing hair, but like if a client came in with mold, honestly, we'd just be having a totally different conversation. So understand that that is definitely something to think about of textured hair and also lifestyle. Now, this one is going to be a little bit, it depends on the person. But one thing that I do always think about is, especially I feel like for clients who have more sensory issues, I personally don't like Genius Wefts for that reason, because you have to think, when you're putting Genius Wefts in someone's hair, you have the sealant, because it has the Genius Weft with the sealant, it has sealant and sealant against hair. And that rubbing, can most people feel that? No, but I can. And that's just one of the reasons why I prefer hand-tied hair. Now, on a professional aspect, personally, I think hand-tied hair is easier to color because it doesn't have the sealant. I think it's easier to stitch because you can go through and not necessarily stitch very quickly, but there's on the seam, there is almost like a little line right in the middle that is like so easy to stitch. I do feel like with Genius Wefts, you almost have to slow down and be a little bit careful, because as you're stitching, if you are pulling those stitches too tight, it's not going to like overly compress the hair. It's going to end up pulling from the scalp, because like that give has to come from somewhere, and it's not going to come from the wefts, because they have that sealant on top. So for me, I just prefer hand-tied hair, especially for those reasons. Now, like I said, a very big pro for hand-tied hair is that even when you color it, the seam does color down. Because sometimes guys, like that seam, like I said, if it is not fully colored down, and you especially feel like if you have a darker client, and then imagine if this right here, these are my extensions, this was like a brighter seam. I mean, honestly, anything lighter than what my hair is now, it's like a highlighter. You're going to notice it, you're going to see it. So yes, some Genius Wefts do have those darker colors, but if you need something that's a little more custom colored because you need it to be more high contrast or whatever it is, you're hand-tied, you can do whatever you want. Genius, you are a little bit more locked into what's already there, like the colors that are already created. So at the end of the day, which one is better? There really isn't an answer. To me, it always comes down to texture, lifestyle. Do they have any kind of like neurodivergencies and like things that just like tend to bug them? And then also what my preference is as well. I will always use hand-tied hair if I can. That is like my foundational, my go-to, my happy place. And from there is where I'm like, okay, well, based on this client, based on the method that we're doing, are we splitting rows? Do they have micro minis? Like, what do I need to do? That will then dictate if I'm going to switch over to Genius Wefts. So at the end of the day, like I said, one is not better than the other. Don't let anybody convince you that it is. I think you should have an understanding of how to use both, when to incorporate one versus the other, or even like how to use them together. And that's why at the end of the day, morning hair carries both. Because I feel like to be a very well-rounded stylist, you have to at least be able to understand how to use both. Otherwise, there's gonna come a point where a client has a problem and you're like, I have no idea how to fix this. So also know, if ever you need any help with anything or you have questions, you are always free to DM me on Instagram. I answer back to literally everyone. Like, talking about hair and extensions and methods is my favorite, or you can just comment down below and I am more than happy to help.